So, welcome to Beauty of Colors podcast, Kamini. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you.
You're very welcome. So, Kamini, tell us a little bit about you and what is your story?
Oh, my story. Well, let me start with today. So today I am a mom of five. My oldest is going to be 23 in a couple months, and then my youngest turns 11 in July. So at the time of this recording, they kind of are in that range. And then professionally, I work with people one-to-one as a human potential coach. And what does that mean? It means I help them understand themselves on a deeper level in order to move themselves forward. And I share that because that work that I do is directly related to my story. So my story really begins being born and raised in a small town in Connecticut where both my parents were immigrants. My mom came to the States when she was 13, and my dad when he was 19, both from India. Um, and we settled in Connecticut, and it was a predominantly white town. So growing up, before I went to school, I really didn't know anything different. But then, of course, I started elementary school, and clearly, a name like Kamini, it's not like everyone else's name, and I certainly looked different than the other kids. So very quickly in school, I recognized that I was different, and my 5-year-old self solved that problem through trying to ensure that people were happy with me and that I was pleasing other people, because I felt like if they liked me because I was, showing up in a way where they were happy, then of course I would be accepted. I would find that belonging. This is how my 5-year-old self solved that issue. And then add on the fact that my parents were working really hard to provide for my sister and I. There was a part of me also that didn't want to be a burden to them. And so I also developed some perfectionist tendencies. Those two things really stuck with me through the course of growing up into my adulthood. And professionally, where I first started working, I was actually a project manager and then found myself running the project management office of a.com. And then after that, running a law practice. But in all of those roles professionally, I kept finding myself drawn to the people that were on my teams and really helping them figure out what they needed in order to move themselves forward and be successful in whatever role that they had. So even professionally, I kept being drawn to people. Now, I shared both that origin story and then, of course, the fact that I'm a mom. And both of those things are really important because through motherhood, I started seeing my children show up in a very people pleasing, perfectionist way that was actually starting to create a lot of anxiety in their lives. And I recognized that that was coming from how I was showing up, and realized that I needed to go through my own self-awareness, self-growth, personal development, if you will, in order to understand, like, why was I showing up that way, and how could I maybe, with that understanding, change or shift. So I went through my own personal development and recognized where that people pleasing had come from, where that perfectionist had come from. Not because my childhood was traumatic in a big T trauma way, but it left me with certain messages and false beliefs about how I needed to take care of others first and foremost, and almost to the detriment of my own needs. And when I was able to recognize that, I was able to start showing up differently as a mom and starting to show my children that they didn't have to do the same thing, right? We could break that pattern. But also through that, I recognized that that was actually my calling. I was meant to go through that experience and that personal journey so that I could take that personal experience and use it to help other people. So that's actually when I jumped headfirst into certification in how to coach people. What is life coaching about? How to help people understand themselves better. Also going through a lot of specialty certifications and trainings in different modalities. And I realized that the reason why professionally I kept being drawn to the people was because that's what I was being called to do. I was being called to work with people one-on-one. And so that's sort of about 7 years ago at this point. That's when my one-on-one practice was born. And I've been coaching people ever since.
Wow. So, Kamini, your one-on-one practice was born 7 years ago, but when were you reborn? When did you figure out that you're not going to please people anymore? And was that before your children were born or after?
It was definitely after. So it was about, I want to say about a decade ago when I was watching my preteen children emulate how I was showing up. And that was the catalyst for me to go do that self work. And that's when I recognized, oh my word, I've been dimming down my own light and almost staying in the shadows because I wanted to make sure that everyone else, their needs were met. And I was not even paying attention to my own needs. Because my 7-year-old self knew that I wanted to work with people one on one. My 7-year-old self used to say, I want to just talk to people and help them. And that had disappeared because everybody else's, what they needed, wanted, expected of me, all of those things had taken kind of center stage. And even in running the law practice, that was my husband's law practice. I was behind the scenes. It was all about putting him forward, making sure he had what he needed. It was his dream to run a law practice. And yet here I was in the background. And so that about a decade ago was when I had that sort of realization that I don't have to people please. I can have my empathetic side, but I don't have to lean so far into it that I then, you know, um, almost self abandon, right? I don't have to give up my own needs in deference to somebody else's.
Wow, so you had this great epiphany. So
Yes.
that's nice.
Yes.
So how can you balance your personal life? How can one balance their personal life with their work life?
Such a great question. And I used to think that balance was everything had to be equal parts. And the way that I now describe balancing our work life with our personal life is recognizing that there's going to be an ebb and flow. There's going to be a give and take. It's not going to be exactly balanced every single day. So one day for me might be more heavily focused on work, but then the next day might be more heavily focused on family. And I just give myself the ability to move with it, almost like when we think about the flow of water, right? It goes, it's never one specific way. We allow it to kind of shift and change as it needs to. And that's how I look at work-life balance is overall it will balance itself out. Even if one day you have to focus more on work and then the next day it's more on personal, it'll balance itself out by just giving yourself permission to be where you're needed or where you want to be on a specific day.
So what are some of the steps in overcoming limiting beliefs? What are some of the steps that you've put together in overcoming that? You don't have to say all of it, but just give us at least three of them in overcoming limiting beliefs.
The very first step in overcoming a limiting belief in my mind is that we have to become aware of it because most of us have these limiting beliefs that are operating behind the scenes almost on autopilot. So again, using me as an example, the limiting belief around um, you know how do you become accepted, right? How do I belong? It's to people please. That's a limiting belief. A really common limiting beliefs too are, I'm not deserving, I'm not enough, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable. Those are very common ones that we find over and over again that we can track a lot of different people's beliefs back to. But so the very first step is to become aware of it. And we become aware of it by going into, you know, looking at patterns and how we're showing up and then getting really curious with it. Like there's a part of me that's showing up this way and operating from this perspective. What's that about? So it's never about judgment or shame. It's just really curiosity, compassionate curiosity. Because as we become aware of what those stories and narratives are, then the second part of it is start to challenge it by saying, okay, well, but what's actually true? And what's actually true about me today at the age I'm at now? Because once we are aware of it, that awareness is the doorway to change. So now we're aware of it, we're at that doorway. Then in order to step through, we actually start asking really important questions like what's actually true, what's actually true about the age that I'm at right now. And then the next step is to then start taking committed action based in your own value system and what's meaningful to you. And that's how we break down those limiting beliefs and how we move through them.
Okay. So that's two steps you mentioned.
Well, it's 3 really. It's about
Okay, okay.
becoming aware,
Yeah, well,
challenging it with what's actually true, and then the 3rd step is really important, which is committed action. I know I boiled it down to 3 steps.
okay, okay.
That's what there's deep work that goes into each of those steps, right? I wish it could be super easy. Be like, "Oh, there's the narrative I've been telling myself." And then, 2
Mm.
seconds later, it's like, "And I'm gonna challenge it by doing, this is actually true, and now I'm gonna take this committed action." There's a lot of like smaller steps within those larger 3 ones, but if I'm gonna boil it down to something that would be easily palatable, those would be the 3 I'd give you.
Sounds good. So, Kamini, tell us a little bit about your book. I know you've written a book.
Yeah.
Why did you wait so long to write this book? And who is the book for?
Oh, I love that question. It's funny. I'll give you the answer to why I waited was because I didn't actually believe it was a limiting belief. I didn't believe that I would write something that people would want to read. And so that was part of, recognizing that, wow, that was more of judgment of self rather than saying, you know what, maybe it's about writing a book that I just want to write and I let people decide whether they want to read it. And them deciding whether they want to read it or not actually has no bearing on my decision to write the book, meaning I can just be in the process of writing and I don't have to focus on a specific outcome when it comes to the book. And that gave me permission to go ahead and write it. And to be fair, it wasn't even, I didn't even set out to necessarily write a book. What I was doing was writing small analogies. They were almost like everyday life analogies of taking an everyday experience and looking at it and saying, how could I maybe even use this everyday experience to grow or evolve? And then what the book ended up being was a compilation of those analogies so that people could honestly pick up the book and kind of read any of them at any given point. They don't have to sit down and read it front to back. So an example of even something was, just sitting in traffic and being stuck by construction and me just glancing out the window and watching these construction workers and how they were methodically, when they were paving a road, they were methodically taking up the old pavement before laying down that new asphalt. And as I was watching this and taking it in, recognizing that that's kind of what personal development is. Sometimes we think, oh, I can just go read a book or listen to 1 or 2 podcasts, and then I can implement the things and I'll suddenly be different. Equally, like with a road, you can't just put down the new asphalt because whatever cracks were there underneath are going to come back through. Usually, you've got to take out the old, which is what I was just describing, recognize that there's these old narratives, these old stories, remove what's no longer serving you, and then lay down the new asphalt or the new way of showing up, right? So that's just an example of what my book is about. It's like, even in these everyday experiences, how can we relate it to maybe a way of continuing to grow and evolve?
So, Kamini, what's the name of your book? And is the book for everybody? What is the genre? And where can the listeners get in touch with you? Where can they get a copy of your book? And do you have any speaking engagements coming up? I'm talking about limiting beliefs and how to overcome that.
So the book itself is called Life's Gentle Reminders. It's actually available on Amazon and even by my website. So if people also want to get in touch with me, my website is kaminiwood.com. And then, of course, I'm also on social media. So Facebook and Instagram, my handle is It's Authentic Me. In terms of speaking engagements, as of right now, I've been speaking at companies where I'm talking about things besides not just limiting beliefs, but things like emotional resilience. Burnout is a big topic that I talk on, as well as things like how to handle different emotions. Anger management is one. How do we deal with anger when it comes up? Because I'm a true believer also that giving our emotions the space that they need to communicate what it is that's happening for us is really important. So a lot of my wellness talks, I'm going into different corporations and having those talks with individuals there as well. So in terms of reaching out to me though, definitely my website, kaminiwood.com. And then of course I am on social media.
Okay. So, if somebody want to book like a speaking engagement with you, they just get in contact with you on your website, has all of that information.
Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
excellent. So, Kamini, do you have any last words for the listeners? If you do, what would you say to someone who is struggling with overcoming self-doubt?
Mm, if somebody's struggling with overcoming self-doubt, the one thing that I would really encourage that individual to do is to take some time to work on things like self-acceptance. So what that means is learning what different parts of you are showing up and what are those parts intention, right? So because with self-doubt, usually it we can track it back to not feeling good enough or feeling like what we have to offer isn't what people want, right? We don't feel like we're accepted. So really what that is about looking at self-acceptance, understanding that all parts of you are welcome, but then also recognizing that some parts may not serve you in the way that they maybe once did. Like, so for instance, my people pleasing part no longer serves me the way that it did when I was 5 or 6 years old. And the other thing that I would offer people listening is something that I came to really cherish on my end, which is, your uniqueness is a gift, right? We do not need to be exact carbon copies of anybody else. And so really coming to this place of embracing who you are on an individual basis, owning that so that you can use that as the way that you then start relating to other people rather than trying to fit in with how you believe you believe they want you to be. It's about being your own individual person and then finding your tribe of people.
Wow, nicely said, Kamini. Well, thank you for being on Beauty of Colors podcast.
Thank you for having me.